Right now, somewhere in Japan, a teenager is walking past a convenience store. He has no idea that 80 years ago, in a basement not far from where he's standing, a team of scientists was racing to build the exact same weapon that would soon end the war his great-grandfather fought in. He has no idea how close they came. Most people don't. The story you've been told is simple. America had the bomb. Japan didn't. End of story. But the real answer is far stranger. Japan didn't fail because the idea never crossed their minds. Japan failed by months, maybe weeks. And the reason that gap existed has almost nothing to do with science and everything to do with something far more human. Let's go back to 1940. A young physicist named Tatsusuburo Suzuki sits down to write a report for the Imperial Japanese Army. The report describes something called nuclear fission. Plain English version: certain atoms, when split apart, release an enormous burst of energy. Far more energy than any explosive humans had ever built. Suzuki's report lands on the desk of a general named Takeo Yasuda. Yasuda isn't a soldier by trade. He's an engineer, and engineers notice things other people miss. He GRE a research project. It gets a code name, NIGO, after the physicist leading it, YOSHIO NISHINA trained in Europe. He worked alongside some of the same scientists who would later help build the American bomb. He understood the physics. He had the right instincts. What he didn't have was the right country. Here's the part most documentaries skip. Japan wasn't behind because its scientists were behind. Japan was behind because its industry was. Building a bomb isn't really a physics problem. It's a manufacturing problem wearing a physics costume. You need to enrich uranium, which means separating one nearly identical atom from another, atom by atom, at a scale of millions. You need cyclotrons, specialized magnets, precision tools, and most of all, you need uranium ore itself, in quantities most countries simply didn't have lying around. America had the Manhattan Project. Over 130,000 people. Entire secret cities built from nothing in the Tennessee hills and the New Mexico desert. Billions of dollars, adjusted for today's money, more than the cost of building the entire automobile industry from scratch, twice over. Japan had a handful of labs, a war economy collapsing under naval blockade, and a uranium supply measured in kilograms instead of tons. Consider the gap in raw terms. America was running its bomb program at the same time it was building aircraft carriers by the dozen, training millions of soldiers, and shipping supplies across two oceans simultaneously. Japan, by 1944, couldn't reliably get oil tankers past American submarines. Its cities were being firebombed faster than they could rebuild. Asking that economy to also fund a parallel Manhattan Project isn't just difficult. It's almost a contradiction in terms. You cannot outbuild the world's largest industrial economy, while that same economy is actively strangling your supply lines. Think about what that actually means. Two countries, both staring down total defeat, both running out of fuel, food, and trained pilots, were still pouring scarce resources into a weapon that might not pay off for years. That's not a footnote. That's a signal. Even in the final months of a collapsing war, someone in Tokyo and someone in Berlin looked at fission and thought, this is worth gambling everything on. So where would Japan have even gotten uranium? This is where the story gets strange. In May 1945, a German U-boat called U-234 surrenders to American forces in the Atlantic. ONBOARD, hidden in the cargo hold, is roughly 560 kilograms of uranium oxide. Its destination: Japan. Germany and Japan, allies in a war they were both losing, were apparently still trying to trade nuclear secrets and materials right up until the final months. That shipment never arrived. The war ended before it could. Two Japanese naval officers were on board that submarine when it surrendered. Rather than be captured, they chose to end their own lives at sea. That single detail tells you almost everything about how seriously this project was taken at the highest levels. Men were willing to die rather than let that cargo, and what it represented fall into enemy hands. Now play out the version where it did. Picture an alternate timeline. The submarine slips past the Allied blockade. The uranium reaches Japanese shores in early 1945 instead of getting seized in the Atlantic. Does that uranium turn into a bomb? Almost certainly not in time. Here's why. Refining raw uranium ore into something close to weapons-grade material isn't like refining oil. It takes massive industrial infrastructure, the kind that takes years to build, not months. America had already spent 3 years and an unprecedented portion of its entire industrial base just getting close. Even with that German shipment in hand, researchers like historian Walter Grundein, who has spent decades studying Japan's wartime nuclear program, have concluded that Japan was nowhere near the industrial capacity required to convert raw material into a working weapon before the war's end. The uranium would have helped. It would not have been enough. But there's a deeper twist buried in this story, and it's the part that actually matters. As Japanese forces retreated from a facility in northern Korea called Hungnam late in the war, they left behind partially built nuclear research infrastructure. The Soviet Red Army moved in shortly after. What happened next is still debated by historians today. Some have argued that captured Japanese equipment and personnel gave a meaningful boost to the early Soviet bomb program. Most historians who examine the documentary record, however, point somewhere else entirely. The Soviet program's biggest leap forward didn't come from captured hardware. It came from espionage. Specifically, intelligence smuggled out of the American Manhattan Project itself by Soviet spies embedded inside it. Stop and sit with that for a second. The single most consequential weapon ever built didn't spread first through military conquest. It spread through information. A handful of people with access and the will to leak it did more to accelerate the nuclear age than entire occupied factories full of equipment. This pattern repeats throughout the early Cold War. Nations didn't catch up to the nuclear frontier primarily by capturing each other's factories or kidnapping each other's scientists, although both happened. They caught up because secrets traveled faster than steel. A blueprint fits in a coat pocket. A cyclotron does not. And once the first nation proved the physics worked at all, the hardest part of the problem, the part that had taken years and consumed a nation's economy, was no longer a mystery. It was just an engineering problem, waiting for the right resources to catch up to the knowledge. So now back to the real question. What if Japan had actually finished the bomb in 1945? Picture it landing not in American hands, but Japanese ones sometime in the summer of that year, weeks before the surrender that actually happened. The war doesn't end the way history remembers it. Maybe a Japanese device is used against an invading American fleet. Maybe it's saved as a last bargaining chip, a threat instead of a weapon. Either way, the calculus changes instantly. The American invasion of the Japanese home islands, an operation that planners on Admiral Nimitz's and General MacArthur's staffs estimated could cost over 1 million casualties, may never happen the way it was planned. Negotiations replace invasion. Or worse, both sides reach for the same weapon at the same time, and the closing chapter of the war turns into something the modern world has never actually witnessed. Two nuclear-armed powers trading blows in real time. Would the device even have worked reliably? That's the question military planners on both sides would have had to gamble on without knowing the answer. America tested its design once, in the New Mexico desert, before ever using it in war. Japan, with its fraction of the resources, would likely have had no such luxury. A first-generation weapon, rushed into the field without a successful test, carries enormous risk of failure, of malfunction, of simply not detonating as designed. History might have remembered a different kind of story entirely, one where the final twist isn't a working bomb, but a failed one, dropped too late to change anything but early enough to make the history books anyway. It's worth pausing here, because this isn't really a story about Japan. It's a story about timing. Physicist Robert Oppenheimer, the man who led the actual Manhattan Project, once described nuclear fission as a problem so compelling that scientists everywhere were naturally drawn to it, regardless of which country they served. The idea wasn't rare. The idea was almost inevitable, once fission itself was discovered in a Berlin laboratory in the late 1930s. What was rare, vanishingly rare, was the specific combination of resources, secrecy, and industrial muscle required to turn that idea into hardware before anyone else. Japan had brilliant scientists. Japan had the theoretical groundwork. What Japan didn't have was an uninterrupted, blockade-free, multi-year runway to build out the industrial base the project actually required. And that gap, more than any single decision or any single scientist, is the real reason the story ended the way it did. Today, Japan is one of the most technologically advanced nations on Earth, with a full civilian nuclear fuel cycle and the scientific capacity to build a weapon faster than almost any country that doesn't already have one. And yet, it has never built one. After the war, Japan adopted a pacifist constitution. It signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1976. It became, in its own words, the only nation to have experienced nuclear war, and chose, deliberately, never to risk causing it. That choice is the actual ending of this story, the part the alternate timeline never gets to see. The capability never went away. Japan could, by most expert estimates, assemble a weapon faster today than the underfunded, blockaded scientists of 1945 ever could have managed. What changed wasn't the science. What changed was the decision to leave that door closed. It's tempting to think of that decision as inevitable, as if any nation that suffered what Japan suffered would obviously choose the same path. But choices like that are never automatic. They get made and remade every single year by people who could just as easily decide otherwise. Japan renews that decision quietly, decade after decade, every time it reaffirms its treaty commitments instead of revisiting them. You rarely hear about a decision like that on the news because nothing dramatic happens when a country chooses not to build something. There's no test footage, no headline, just an absence year after year that took as much will to maintain as it would have taken effort to abandon. So the next time you watch a headline scroll by about a country edging closer to a weapon it doesn't yet have, remember Suzuki's basement report, and Nishina's lab, and a German submarine carrying material that never made it to shore in time. Remember that the line between a different 20th century and the one we actually got wasn't drawn by genius or ideology. It was drawn by something as unglamorous as industrial supply chains and a few months of timing. Right now, somewhere in Japan, that teenager is still walking past the convenience store. He still has no idea how close his country once came to a different history entirely. And neither, until a few minutes ago, did you.